of a holy month, a general strike, broached in 1839 by the Chartists, was revived. This time, however, it was not the working men who wished to quit work, but the manufacturers who wished to close their mills, and send the operatives into the country parishes upon the property of the aristocracy, thus forcing the Tory Parliament and the Tory Ministry to repeal the Corn Laws. A revolt would naturally have followed, but the bourgeoisie stood safely in the background, and could await the result without compromising itself, if the worst came to the worst. At the end of July business began to improve. It was high time. In order not to lose the opportunity, 3 firms in Stalybridge reduced wages in spite of the improvement 232, whether they did so of their own motion, or in agreement with other manufacturers, especially those of the League, I do not know. 2 withdrew after a time, but the third, William Bailey and Brothers, stood firm, and told the objecting operatives that, if this did not please them, they had better go and play a bit. This contemptuous answer the hands received with cheers. They left the mill, paraded through the town, and called upon all their fellows to quit work. In a few hours every mill stood idle, and the operatives marched to Mottram Moor to hold a meeting. This was on August 5th. August 8th they proceeded to Ashton and Hyde 5,000 strong, closed all the mills and coal pits, and held meetings, in which, however, the question discussed was not, as the bourgeoisie had hoped, the repeal of the Corn Laws, but, a fair day's wages for a fair day's work. August 9th they proceeded to Manchester, unresisted by the authorities or Liberals, and closed the mills. On the 11th they were in Stockport, where they met with the first resistance as they were storming the workhouse, the favourite child of the bourgeoisie. On the same day there was a general strike and disturbance in Bolton, to which the authorities here too made no resistance. Soon the uprising spread throughout the whole manufacturing district, and all employments, except harvesting and the production of food, came to a standstill. But the rebellious operatives were quiet. They were driven into this revolt without wishing it. The manufacturers, with the single exception of the Tory Burleigh, in Manchester, had, contrary to their custom, not opposed it. The thing had begun without the working men's having any distinct end in view, for which reason they were all united in the determination not to be shot at for the benefit of the Corn Law repealing bourgeoisie. For the rest, some wanted to carry the charter, others who thought this premature wished merely to secure the wages rate of 1840. On this point the whole insurrection was wrecked. If it had been from the beginning an intentional, determined working men's insurrection, it would surely have carried its point, but these crowds who had been driven into the streets by their masters, against their own will, and with no definite purpose, could do nothing. Meanwhile the bourgeoisie, which had not moved a finger to carry the alliance of February 10 into effect, soon perceived that the working men did not propose to become its tools, and that the illogical manner in which it had abandoned its law-abiding standpoint threatened danger. It therefore resumed its law-abiding attitude, and placed itself upon the side of government as against the working men. It swore in trusty retainers as special constables the German merchants in Manchester, took part in this ceremony, and marched in an entirely superfluous manner through the city with their cigars in their mouths and thick truncheons in their hands. It gave the command to fire upon the crowd in Preston, so that the unintentional revolt of the people stood all at once face to face, not only with the whole military power of the government, but with the whole property-holding class as well. The working men, who had no especial aim, separated gradually, and the insurrection came to an end without evil results. Later, the bourgeoisie was guilty of one shameful act after another, tried to whitewash itself, by expressing a horror of popular violence by no means consistent with its own revolutionary language of the spring, laid the blame of insurrection upon Chartist instigators, whereas it had itself done more than all of them together, to bring about the uprising, and resumed its old attitude of sanctifying the name of the law with a shamelessness perfectly unequalled. The Chartists, who were all but innocent of bringing about this uprising, who simply did what the bourgeoisie meant to do, when they made the most of their opportunity, were prosecuted and convicted, while the bourgeoisie escaped without loss, and had, besides, sold off its sold stock of goods with advantage during the pause in work. The fruit of the uprising was the decisive separation of the proletariat from the bourgeoisie. The Chartists had not hitherto concealed their determination to carry the Charter at all costs, even that of a revolution. The bourgeoisie, which now perceived, all at once, the danger with which any violent change threatened its position, refused to hear anything further of physical force, and proposed to attain its end by a moral force, as though this were anything else than the direct or indirect threat of physical force. This was one point of dissension, though even this was removed later by the assertion of the Chartists, who were at least as worthy of being believed as the bourgeoisie, that they too refrained from appealing to physical force. The second point of dissension, and the main one, which brought Chartism to light in its purity, was the repeal of the Corn Laws. In this the bourgeoisie was directly interested, the proletariat not. The Chartists therefore divided into two parties whose political programs agreed literally, but which were nevertheless thoroughly different and incapable of union. At the Birmingham National Convention, in January, 1843, Sturge, the representative of the radical bourgeoisie, proposed that the name of the Charter be omitted from the rules of the Chartist Association, nominally because this name had become connected with recollections of violence during the insurrection, a connection, by the way, which had existed for years, and against which Mr. Sturge had hitherto advanced no objection. The working men refused to drop the name, and when Mr. Sturge was outvoted, that worthy Quaker suddenly became loyal, betook himself out of the hall, and founded a complete suffrage association within the radical bourgeoisie. So repugnant had these recollections become to the Jacobinical bourgeoisie, that he altered even the name universal suffrage into the ridiculous title, complete suffrage. The working men laughed at him, and quietly went their way. From this moment Chartism was purely a working man's cause, freed from all bourgeois element. The complete journals, the Weekly Dispatch, Weekly Chronicle, Examiner, etc., fell gradually into the sleepy tone of the other liberal sheets, espoused the cause of free trade, attacked the 10 Hours Bill and all exclusively working men's demands, and let their radicalism as a whole fall rather into the background. The radical bourgeoisie joined hands with the liberals against the working men in every collision, and in general made the Corn Law question, which for the English is the free trade question, their main business. They thereby fell under the dominion of the liberal bourgeoisie, and now play a most pitiful role. The Chartist working men, on the contrary, espoused with redoubled zeal all the struggles of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. Free competition has caused the workers suffering enough to be hated by them. Its apostles, the bourgeoisie, are their declared enemies. The workingman has only disadvantages to await from the complete freedom of competition. The demands hitherto made by him, the 10 Hours Bill, protection of the workers against the capitalist, good wages, a guaranteed position, repeal of the New Poor Law, all of the things which belong to Chartism quite as essentially as the 6 points, are directly opposed to free competition and free trade. No wonder, then, that the working men will not hear of free trade and the repeal of the Corn Laws, a fact incomprehensible to the whole English bourgeoisie, and while at least wholly indifferent to the Corn Law question, are most deeply embittered against its advocates. This question is precisely the point at which the proletariat separates from the bourgeoisie, Chartism from radicalism, and the bourgeois understanding cannot comprehend this, because it cannot comprehend the proletariat. Therein lies the difference between Chartist democracy and all previous political bourgeois democracy. Chartism is of an essentially social nature, a class movement. The 6 points which for the radical bourgeois are the beginning and end of the matter, which are meant, at the utmost, to call forth certain further reforms of the Constitution, are for the proletarian a mere means to further ends. Political power our means, social happiness our end, is now the clearly formulated quackery of the Chartists. The knife and fork question of the preacher Stephens was a truth for a part of the Chartists only, in 1838, it is a truth for all of them in 1845. There is no longer a mere politician among the Chartists, and even though their socialism is very little developed, though their chief remedy for poverty has hitherto consisted in the land allotment system, which was superseded 235 by the introduction of manufacture, though their chief practical propositions are apparently of a reactionary nature, yet these very measures involve the alternative that they must either succumb to the power of competition once more, and restore the old state of things, or they must themselves entirely overcome competition and abolish it. On the other hand, the present indefinite state of Chartism, the separation from the purely political party, involves that precisely the characteristic feature, its social aspect, will have to be further developed. The approach to socialism cannot fail, especially when the next crisis directs the working men by force of sheer want to social instead of political remedies. And a crisis must follow the present active state of industry and commerce in 1847 at the latest, and probably in 1846, 1-2, which will far exceed in extent